Throughout ordinary life, I routinely take myself to know a great deal of mundane facts about my immediate external environment. Right now, I currently take it that I know that there's a laptop before me, that I have two hands, and that it's sunny outside today. Indeed, I often take it that it is obvious that I know these things. But when we start to think philosophically about the matter, these ordinary claims to knowledge become less obvious. Perhaps we cannot take them for granted. And in fact, there is a whole philosophical school of thought called skepticism, which claims that it isn't possible to know these things. Consider a belief that you would think is the easiest thing to know in the world. Let's take my belief that I have hands. This would seem, in most circumstances, to be a perfectly safe claim to knowledge. How could I possibly fail to know that I have hands when I see them right here in front of my face? But the skeptic would argue that I could be mistaken. And since I could be mistaken, it follows that I cannot even know this plain fact. Here's how the skeptic would argue this. First, they will bring to our attention the possibility of a radical scenario in which I would be deceived into believing falsely. Maybe they will say that I could be dreaming right now, or maybe I am actually lying asleep in my bed, and the laptop that I think I see before me and these hands are just figments of my dream. Or maybe I'm a victim of an even greater scheme of deception. Some skeptics are fond of using this example from science fiction. Imagine that my brain has been removed from my body and placed into a vat of life-sustaining fluid and then hooked up to a supercomputer. The supercomputer is then sending electrical impulses into my sensory pathways to create a simulation of all of the experiences that I would normally have if I were still in my body. In this scenario, it would appear to me as if I was looking at a computer right now, and that I still had hands. From my perspective, as the brain in a vat, things would seem just as if they were just as they would in normal everyday life. But when we reflect on these possibilities, we'll see that it's very difficult to rule them out. For every experience that I have in real life, my brain-in-a-vat counterpart would have experiences that would appear to them to be just as my experiences appear to me. It might seem as if I'm looking at my hand right now. But then again, to the brain-in-a-vat, it would also seem to them as if it was looking at a hand. So it would seem that I cannot rule out the possibility that I am a brain-in-a-vat right now just by consulting my first personal experience. As far as things appear to me, from my perspective, everything would appear the same whether I am in real life or whether I am the brain experiencing a simulated artificial world. After raising this hypothetical scenario, the skeptic then offers the following argument. Premise 1. If I know that I have hands, then I know that I am not a handless brain in a vat. Premise 2. I do not know that I am not a handless brain in a vat. Conclusion, therefore, I do not know that I have hands. So that's the skeptic's argument. It ends with a very radical conclusion, that I don't even know that I have hands. This is despite the fact that, as I remarked earlier, this seemed to be something that I could easily know. Also notice that there isn't anything about this argument that depends on the belief being about hands in particular. Any belief about my external environment could have been used in its place. So the idea behind this argument gives rise to a much more general and radical conclusion, that I cannot know anything about the external world before me, no matter how plainly it lies before my face. Okay, so as philosophers, what should we do about this argument? Observe that the argument is valid. So if both of the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true as well. So really, you only have three options to respond to this argument. Either you accept the conclusion, you deny premise 1, or you deny premise 2. Let's look at each of these options. The skeptic would prefer that you take the first option and accept the conclusion of the argument. Remember, the skeptic thinks that you can't know anything at all about the external world. Genuine knowledge about the external reality, they say, is impossible. So is this a good response to this argument? Well, maybe it is. I'm not going to dictate how you make up your mind on this question. I will mention that some skeptics might try to soften the blow of their conclusion with considerations like these. They will say that maybe true knowledge has always been too high and lofty of a goal. Maybe true knowledge is impossible, but that's okay, they will say, because you shouldn't aspire for something so grand. Maybe instead what we should aim for is beliefs that are merely highly probable or highly acceptable or credible, even though they will fall short of true knowledge. Is this a good consolation prize if the skeptic turns out to be right? Maybe it is. Again, I'm not here to solve this problem, but again, maybe not. Some philosophers have objected to this line of thought by saying that we do need knowledge because knowledge informs how to rationally act. It is irresponsible for us to act on a belief if we don't really know it. And so that is reason to think that knowledge should be our aspiration. Other philosophers will respond to this argument by rejecting the first premise, which says that if you know that you have hands, then you must be able to rule out the possibility that you are a brain in a vat. These philosophers are called fallibilists. According to them, knowledge does not require infallibility. It doesn't require absolute certainty. You don't need to rule out every possibility of being wrong. For them, genuine knowledge is consistent with the mere possibility of being wrong, provided that that possibility is improbable or remote. According to them, all that's required for knowledge is true belief and evidence that makes your belief very probable or credible. But you don't need absolute certainty. So as long as the brain-in-a-vat scenario is very improbable or far-fetched or slight or a remote possibility, then according to the fallibilist, it doesn't destroy your knowledge. Is this a good solution? Well, again, there's a lot of debate about this, especially over the past century, as to whether fallibilism is really viable. And I'm not really going to go into the details in this video, but suffice to say that fallibilism as such has some unintuitive consequences. It just, for a variety of reasons, seems unintuitive to allow that a subject can know something if they could also be wrong about it. All right, so that brings us now to the third solution, which is to deny the second premise. Remember, premise 2 says that I do not know that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. If I were to deny this premise, then I must hold that I do know that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. But how is that possible? How can I know that I'm not a handless brain in a vat? Now, there have been many valiant attempts throughout the history of philosophy to prove the existence of the world, and that we can know the existence of the external world, just from the materials that we get from our first personal experience. Probably most famous of all is the one that comes from René Descartes, where he gave an a priori proof that God exists and then appealed to the fact that God would not deceive him, and so he could trust his senses. I talked about this in my last video about Descartes. Today, we're going to talk about a different proof of the external world. This one comes from the English philosopher G.E. Moore. In one of his public lectures, Moore claimed to prove the existence of external objects, and he claimed that he could know that external objects exist. How could he prove this? Well, here's his argument. Behold the proof of the external world. Moore lifts up one hand and says, here is a hand. He lifts up another hand and says, here is another hand. And he concludes, therefore, external objects exist. Moore held that this was a perfectly sufficient proof of the existence of external objects. On this basis, he claimed, he could know that there were external objects. Or alternatively, we could say that Moore claimed to know that he wasn't in a radical skeptical scenario. Moore doesn't mention the brain-in-a-vat scenario by name, but this would be amongst the scenarios that he thinks that he can rule out with his proof. And it is precisely because he knows, for example, that he has hands that he thinks that he can know that he isn't a brain in a vat. So now let me ask you, do you think that Moore has accomplished his goal? Has he proven that he knows that the external world exists? Has he proven that he isn't a brain in a vat? Is that all it takes to show that skepticism is wrong? Now, I think I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking that Moore's flat-footed, hard-headed proof doesn't really take the skeptic's argument very seriously. His argument seems to, quote-unquote, beg the question, or reveal that Moore is simply failing to see or refusing to see what the skeptic's problem is. If that's how you feel, then let me say to you that the real interest in Moore's proof isn't just in the simple flat-footed argument that appeals to his hands. What's interesting about Moore's paper is that there's this higher order discussion of why Moore thinks that his argument should be sufficient. This discussion surrounding the proof forces us to take a step back and ask more fundamental questions about the philosophical debate surrounding skepticism. We need to ask such questions as, who has the burden of proof here? Is it the skeptic or the person who accepts the common sense claim that I know that I have hands? And secondly, what does it even mean to beg the question? Let's go back to the skeptic's original argument. Remember, the skeptic reasons in the following way. Let's call this the skeptic's argument. Premise 1. If I know that I have hands, then I know that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. Premise 2. I do not know that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. Conclusion, therefore, I do not know that I have hands. As Moore sees it, the skeptic is arguing from strange premises that come from philosophy to a conclusion that denies sheer common sense. Moore would instead prefer to flip the argument on its head and argue the other way. Here's an alternative argument that one could present instead. Let's call this the Moorean shift argument. Premise 1. If I know that I have hands, then I know that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. That's the same premise as before. Premise 2. I do know that I have hands. Conclusion, therefore, I know that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. Do you see the difference between these two arguments? Basically, the second premise and the conclusion are contraposed. The skeptic reasons in this way. Since I don't know that I'm not a handless brain in a vat, therefore, I do not know that I have hands. Moore, on the other hand, responds with the Moore shift argument that goes in the other direction. Since I know that I have hands, therefore, I know that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. So you see that the two directions of these arguments are different. They represent different starting places to conduct our reasoning about skepticism. On the one hand, we can start with the premise that says, I know that I have hands, like Moore does. Or we can start with the premise that I don't know that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. That's what the skeptic does. This now raises the question, of course. Which premise should we start with? Moore claims that his direction is the superior one. Why? Because according to him, he is starting with a premise that is just an artifact of common sense. Of course, he says, I know that I have hands. What could be more obvious than that? The skeptic, on the other hand, is starting with a strange claim about our knowledge about a science fiction example. And since it's a strange example, a strange belief to have about brains in vats, Moore suggests that we can't be quite as certain about it or sure about it as we can compared to the obvious claim that I know that I have hands. So given the choice between the two, which one should we choose? How do we begin our inquiry about skepticism? For Moore, the choice is clear. We should start with common sense. Common sense has priority over our intuitions about strange beliefs about science fiction. I think I would like to end this video here. I can now leave you with the question of whether this response by Moore is legitimate. What do you think? Should we follow the common sense line of reasoning, or should we follow the skeptic's line of reasoning? What should be the correct starting point for doing philosophy? I'll just say that there's also this whole other issue about Moore that I didn't even get to talk about. And that is this question of whether Moore is quote-unquote begging the question or using a circular argument when he gives his proof of the external world. But unfortunately, it would take me about 5 minutes to get into the details of this question, and I'm really trying to keep these videos short. So ask me about it some other time.